Hi, Don Feeney, Dakota County Master Gardener, here to give you an update on the progress of our tomato trials here at South St. Paul. If you look around, you'll see that the tomatoes are by and large lush and thriving and wonderfully no sign of disease yet. What we are not seeing is very much fruit being set. Now we have some so this you'll see here a few little baby tomatoes setting, but not still what we'd expect. And the reason for that is the heat that we've been experiencing. Tomatoes, if you have daytime temperatures over 90, nighttime temperatures over 70, the flowers tend to fall off before they have a chance to pollinate, and tomatoes largely self-pollinate, they're not insect reliant, and to form the fruit. And I think we're seeing that in the tomatoes here, that the fruit set is delayed for that reason. And hopefully now that we've been getting temperatures a little cooler, we have not been getting as much into the 90s, we will begin to see our tomatoes form a little more fruit. But otherwise, things are looking good. And what I'd like to talk about today are how we support tomatoes, because tomatoes left to their own devices it's a vine, and they will just sprawl on the ground, and some people do grow them that way. But when you do that, you are inviting the fruit to rot on the ground, and you're inviting little critters, mice, voles, squirrels, chipmunks, whatever, to come along and nibble your tomatoes. So it's not a really advisable thing to do. You want to be able to get that plant up off the ground and support it somehow. Now, there are two primary ways of doing that. One is, as we were doing here, to put them in large cages, and that basically lets them sprawl. The cage itself, you can see, will support the leaves as they grow up. Now, the second way to do it is to stake them. Basically, train them to a single leader and let them grow straight up. Now, we are doing a bit of an experiment on a couple of the plants. Over here, we have two plants of the same variety. It's Carmelo, which is a hybrid from Italy, which is actually my favorite large fruited tomato. There's a legend that hybrids have no flavor. And Carmelo will prove, I think, and we'll see later on, that's quite simply not true. Now, here we have one Carmelo in a cage and another Carmelo on not really a stake. This is called a tomato ladder, which is kind of a modified stake. I like these simply because if you just have a stake, you have to be constantly tying the plant to the stake. Here, the tomato ladder allows you to for the leaves themselves and the stems to support it. Now, what you do have to do, though, with a tomato ladder or any other kind of stake, is prune it to keep it in bounds. And what you do is you look for, if you see that in the notch, you have the stem coming up, you have the leaves going out, and then you have these what are called suckers growing in between. And that's what makes a tomato super bushy. What you want to do is just pinch those out. And that's the way you keep the tomato confined to the single stem and the stake. Now, and tuck the leaves in when you get the chance. Now, if you miss some, not a big deal. In the cage, by and large, you don't do that. You still maybe want to keep them under some degree of control and pinch out at least some of the larger suckers. The reason for that is what you really need tomatoes need good air circulation around the plants. That is probably the single best thing you can do to prevent disease. Most diseases, actually of all plants, but particularly tomatoes, are fungal. And they thrive in moisture. They thrive in poor air circulation. And the more air you can get blowing around the tomatoes, the less intense your disease issues are likely to be. So a cage, you need to space them further apart because the plants are bushier. And I would generally recommend if you're growing tomatoes in a cage to have about 3 feet between the cages, between the plants. If you're staking them, you can plant them closer. I've seen recommendations, that you can plant them as close to a foot apart. I think that's a little too close. I think you're inviting more disease issues there. The plant's leaves will be intermingling and such. I generally, for staking, would like to do 18 inches to 2 feet apart. Now, the advantage of that is that way, if you're a fanatic like me, you can get more varieties of tomatoes in the same amount of space. I personally am growing 36 different varieties of tomatoes this year. I would not have the space to put all of those in cages, so I do them on stakes. Now, the other advantage of staking them is you get your fruit faster. Because the plant is not putting as much energy into sending out lots and lots of vegetation, those fruit that form have more of the plant's energy, nutrients, and so on to help them get riper faster. Now, the opposite side of that coin is with a cage where you have more foliage, more stems, more flower blossom clusters. Overall, you will get more fruit from a single plant. That's somewhat obviated by being able to fit more tomato plants with a stake in a smaller area. Listen, I generally will stake my tomatoes. Other people swear by cages. Those are the advantages and disadvantages. Fewer fruit, earlier fruit. More fruit, a bit later fruit. Although we will test that, we will see what happens with these two side-by-side examples of the same variety as the year goes on. One thing I've noticed this morning is that our staked tomato here actually has several fruit forming, which, as I mentioned, is not something that you're seeing a lot of early fruit forming this year. However, again, the same variety, when we've caged it and let it just basically set lots of branches and put out lots of foliage, I'm not seeing any fruit forming yet. So the idea that you get earlier fruit by staking, in this case, seems to be borne out. We'll see how they mature. So just whatever you do, remember to support your tomatoes in some way or other, and keep an eye on, do some pruning, although again, there are people who say with the cages, you don't need to do any pruning. I still like to, on a plant, say like this one, which is nice and bushy, still prune out some of the suckers to help the air circulation. Now, if you happen to miss a sucker and you get this big side branch coming off that you miss, not a big deal. You just can pinch off the tip at some point, and it'll, like this, and that will still give you some of the, most of the benefits of pruning. It's not something to get high stress over, but whenever I walk through my tomatoes, I'll look around to see if there's anything that needs to be pruned. Until next time, happy gardening.